just have to open with, I do have a teenager. I have 2 preteens. In the US, we call them QWERTY monsters because that age group tends to send more text messages than any other. So on average in the US, 2,000 text messages per month. And then they look at their mobile phones as appliances to send texts. They don't like to pick it up and call you. In fact, my son says that's just too much trouble when I can text you. But my story about my son, he's just turned 13, but when he was, I'd say, just turning 12, he asked me, "Mommy, can I have a Facebook page?" And I said, "No, you have to wait till you're 13, because that is the user agreement, you have to be of age." And so a few months later, I sort of peeked over his shoulder while he was doing his homework on his laptop, and I noticed he was on Facebook with his own Facebook page. And I said, "I told you you couldn't do that." And he said, "Well, all my friends do it. I'm being left out of, important social decisions. I don't have any friends anymore because I'm not on Facebook." And I said, "Well, okay, but there has to be certain guidelines. And the first is you have to friend me." So I was watching him friend me, and there's a technique where you can put someone, he tried to put me in a group, everybody but mommy. So he okay, to me, that he could post things and I wouldn't be able to see them. And I said, no, I want full access. And he said, as long as you don't post anything stupid and embarrassing on my wall, I'll do that. I said, no, you have to do that. And I said, okay, now the next thing I want is your password. And he was like, "But that's my privacy." And I said, "Well, you can have your privacy when you're 18, but I want to just make sure that I'm not going to read everything. I want to just spot check, and I want to make sure that you're following good safety, privacy rules, and that you're respectful of your friends, and your friends are respectful of you." He said, "No, I'm not giving my password to you." And I said, "Do you know who wrote the foreword to Mommy's first book?" And he looked at me, "Who?" And I said, "Randy Zuckerberg." "Is that Mark Zuckerberg's sister?" I said, "Yes." And I said, "If you don't give me your password, I'm going to tell Randy, and she's going to bust you and all your friends for being on Facebook because you're under 13. And he said, "Okay, my password is." So now started sort of what we call complicated, because now I had to make a group that's everybody but Harry, because I was using my Facebook profile to get parenting advice. So I don't want my son in on those conversations. And so the next thing that started to happen was I was happened to be doing a training with for African Women's Leadership Institute in a beautiful place in Rwanda. And this issue came up: how do we parent in this connected age? And I was explaining some of the rules that we have in our house, and I pulled up my son's Facebook page, and there was an image on there, and it was the cover of the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue with a woman in a bikini. And so I just, at that point, had to text my husband and say, "I think you need to have a talk with Harry about, ask him if there's anything he wants to know." Okay, and then we had to actually start to negotiate guidelines around, if I was allowed to post his picture on my profile, I had to ask his permission, which is okay. I want to respect his privacy. There was actually a lesson that I was trying to teach him about, what he posted on the page is essentially public, and you want to be respectful of your friends. And I said, okay, I will be respectful of you, and I will ask if I can post your picture. And so we were out for dinner, and I had been using another application called Instagram. I don't know if you're familiar with Instagram. It's photo sharing. And we have a rule when we go out to dinner is that nobody can text or have their cell phones be doing this under the table until the end of the meal when we're about to leave. And so the end of the meal was coming, and my daughter, everybody's sort of on their cell phone, and I took a picture of my kids, and I posted it on Instagram, texting under the table. And within 2 minutes, there was a reply to my Instagram from my son that said, "Monkey see, monkey do." So I guess all this to say that that it's not just about the tools. It's really it's having profound effects in our personal and family relationships. It's having profound effects in our work relationships, and it'll also have profound effects on civil society and the way community people relate to one another. And that was kind of a lot of what I talked about in my first book was how nonprofits need to, change the way they do their work, nonprofits or NGOs, given living in this connected age. And so the thesis of that book was that nonprofits can no longer be effective working as isolated institutions. They need to work more like networks and become network nonprofits. And the kind of qualities of being a network nonprofit was about building relationships. It was about being transparent. It was this two-way communication versus, broadcasting. And at that time, this is back a few years, I'd hear from nonprofits, we did that Facebook thing and it didn't work. Or we were on Twitter, but it didn't do anything for us. And that's because there was sort of in order to be effective, they had to have a mindset change about the way they worked, as opposed to just jumping into the tools. And I think about the story I heard from a woman who was the CEO of an organization in the US called Goodwill, which is a social enterprise that collects used clothing and then sells it at low cost, and the profits go to support employment training programs for people living in poverty. And they have affiliates around the US, work as a network. And so this was the California affiliate, and she got up and she said, well, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, but they didn't think they were really using it effectively. They weren't really getting much out of it. And she was up late one night, going through her email, and she got an email, and she was up late because they were going through layoffs, cut back, when there's budget, is the word used here, layoffs? Yeah, okay, so it's kind of universal. And that's a really hard decision to go through, who gets laid off. And in about 2 in the morning, she got an email from some people on her staff saying, we want to be involved in the layoff decisions. And this is something that senior management was addressing, sort of in confidence. And she thought, I better call my board chair. She waited in the morning and said, and I talked to them about this. And they were talking, and she said, well, they didn't start a Facebook group on their own. And then she realized that, they could have gone out there with their request and taken it out to a network, and it could have been, a risk. It could have escalated into a public relations crisis for them. But the employees felt enough trust to go to them internally first. And so what that said to her was, well, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, but we're not really being a network nonprofit. It's really about a whole dramatic redesign of our organization. So they systematically put into place a process for becoming a network nonprofit. First was, working steadily on the culture change. Having more staff people involved and having a presence on social channels on behalf of the organization, practicing and getting more comfortable being transparent and sort of opening up. And now they have been able to gauge their local community more effectively, and they're really able to see effective results from their social media. So this whole idea of leading with a networked mindset, I like to call it. And what does that mean? And that's the hardest thing, I think, because it's sort of intangible. It's really about a way of working and a way of thinking. And I think about some of the NGO leaders that I've worked with that are now embracing this way of working. And I think about Carolyn Miles, who's the CEO of Save the Children, and she has a Twitter presence that's in her name. It's not just, they have a branded presence, but there's one that's Carolyn for Save the Children, and it's her. And it's this new way of being a nonprofit professional. So it used to be that you never showed anything personal, or that you were human, or your hobbies, or it was always hiding sort of behind the logo and the corporate or the organizational talking points, and you never varied from your message. And so here she is, she will tweet, she'll talk about going into the State Department to talk about children's issues, and the next tweet will be a photo of a walk on the beach. And that's a hard transition, I think, for a lot of NGO leaders to go from this sort of very traditional approach to opening up. And why do that? You hear, why should they do that? And I could tell you many, many stories of nonprofit CEOs doing that. And I hear on the foundation side, for example, from Jim Canales, for the CEO of the Irvine Foundation. He's on Twitter as himself. And I asked him, I interviewed him, and I said, well, why are you doing this? What do you get from it? You're a foundation CEO. You really want more people connecting with you? And he said for him, he can connect with his colleagues, other people in the world of philanthropy, and it can also bring him contact with people that he would, and ideas that he would not normally be exposed to. It's also a way for their foundation that wants to be transparent. It's part of the transparency. So he said it used to be where you would read through your journals, you'd go through the newspaper, but now Twitter's become this really important source for information, and it's a lot more efficient for him to access it. And so for him, he said it's not necessarily, at first it was like, where am I going to find the time? How many of us say, oh yeah, I'm going to get on another social network? Hello.
Hi, I'm Anne, and I'm obviously late, so sorry about that. I misunderstood me.
And you can take this one if you want.
Oh, okay.
I'll go to sleep.
I'm sure.
Yeah, no, it's fine because I might need to go out for a meeting.
That's great. So he said it's not so much about finding the time; it's actually making the time. So network mindset. Where was I? I've been kind of wandering, keeping it a little bit organic here. Most of my work, I've been in the nonprofit sector about 34 years, and in the last 20 of those, I got involved with the nonprofit technology movement. I felt really privileged because I had kind of a front row seat at the beginning of this field. And I started as a network weaver for an online network of artists called ArtsWire. And I applied for the job, and I told them I didn't know a modem from a microwave. I just didn't know anything about the technology. But that I could learn it, and I could turn around and transfer this knowledge to other people. And so that kind of launched my career as a trainer, a master trainer, and working with many different NGOs and many different places in the world. And I have a particular space in my heart for Cambodia, because I've adopted 2 children from Cambodia. And so over the years, I was one of the first people to experiment integrating social media with fundraising, and able to raise lots of money to support children in Cambodia, and the first person to use Twitter for fundraising. And what happened was from many, many years of networking with young people who were online, young people in Cambodia, writing blogs, and this is back in 2005, 2006, 2007, because I wanted to learn about the culture, and I wanted to, and at first in the old days, I would Google, and I would find web pages and read them, but then I found that there were bloggers, these young people in Cambodia, and I could ask them questions, and they would respond in real time, or they would get on Skype with me, and they would teach me Khmer. And I remember one actually sitting down on Skype and reading telling a story to my kids when they were little. And it was just amazing to me that you could actually reach out and connect with people literally around the world and learn from them. And so they invited me to come and do the first bloggers conference in Cambodia. This was 2007. And just at the time, I'd just gotten on Twitter. It was very new. At that time, people were like, what's Twitter? Isn't that what people talk about what their cat ate for breakfast? Why would I use that? Talk in 140 characters? That's silly. And I thought, well, maybe I could try to raise some money on this. Maybe I could ask, because they'd asked if I could come, and they said, but we don't have any money. And I said, well, let me raise money to sponsor the conference and come over there. So I raised enough money on Twitter within a few days to sponsor the conference. And then I talked to them on Skype, and I said, okay, I have money now to sponsor the conference, and I can come over. What should I bring you from America? And they said the word, I don't know if this is going to translate, but they said schwank. And I'm like, what is schwank? And they said tech t-shirts from America. And so the term in American is swag. I don't know if they have that here, but swag is branded giveaways, t-shirts, or
Coffee mugs.
Yeah, coffee mugs, that sort of thing. So I said, oh, that's great, where am I going to get? I didn't know anybody who worked for, at that point, companies in Silicon Valley. So I started tweeting, asking people, do you have t-shirts? I'm going to Cambodia. The Cambodians buy t-shirts from tech companies. And every time I tweeted, somebody would tweet back with, oh, somebody from Google said, we have a few in the closet. Someone from Yahoo said, oh, here's a bunch we have left over from a trade show. And before I knew it, I was literally getting phone calls. Hi, I work for this department in Google, and somebody told me about your tweet for t-shirts, and I want to send you some t-shirts. So I had like 300 t-shirts in about 3 days that I could take over to Cambodia. So it was just amazing to me how these tools can, if you are using the principles of being networked and you're building relationships and you're being transparent, the abundance that can come from building a network. And it starts with a mind shift change. I think, I'll open it up from here. Questions?
How do you get a big network on, particularly Twitter in New Zealand? We find Twitter has been much slower getting a good sized network. Facebook's fine, we've got hundreds on Facebook, and that's proving very beneficial.
See, the question to ask is never start with asking about the tools, because you really need to think about, what is the intention of your network, and who are the initial players and nodes that you need to connect with, and then what are the tools and ways that they're communicating, and kind of meeting people where they're at. So, Twitter's big in the U.S., so it's appropriate, it was appropriate for me to use Twitter. And if it's not something that's big here in New Zealand, maybe you're going where the people are at. Maybe it is Facebook. But again, it's knowing, what is it that you want to accomplish with your network, and who are the players, and then having a sense of who are they connected to. So then you can start, and who are they not connected to? Because the principle is really being a bridge. You're making bridges between the islands. And that's how you start to build a network. So it's not trying to reach everybody all at once, but it's really working through, and in my network, for example, I look, and it doesn't matter what platform, I look for the mayor. Do you have mayors here? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I look for who is the person in that topic area or in that community or in that discipline area that everyone respects and listens to. And how am I connected with them, and how can I get connected to them? And in making connections with people and building relationships, and this might sound obvious, it's never starting with an ask. You have to say, will you follow me? Will you do this for me? It's more like, how can I help you? And I'll tell you a story about this. There is, and again, it's Twitter, but it could be Facebook. There's an amazing activist name. His name on Twitter is Hardly Normal, but his real life name is Mark Horvath, and he runs a small NGO called Invisible People, and he is an advocate for homeless people. And what his NGO does is he has literally traveled the world, telling their stories to shine up, putting them on YouTube or Facebook, up on his blog, Twitter, and building this network of people who want to then help homeless in their communities because they've heard these stories, and how resources then begin to get shared. And so when I met him, we were both profiled in an article in the Huffington Post called 11 Twitter Activists You Should Know. And he reached out to me, and at first, I didn't make the connection between Hardly Normal and Mark Horvath. So who's this guy, Hardly Normal, who's connecting with me? And he happened to have been watching my Twitter stream, and I mentioned that I was taking a drive down the coast with my kids and taking them to Disneyland. It was our first year in California. And he connected with me and said, you know what, I just had these tickets donated to Disneyland, and I was supposed to give it to a homeless family, but they don't have a car, they can't get there. I'd like to give to you, and would you come have coffee? And so we had coffee, we met, and I actually paid him in Target gift cards that he could give back to homeless people to buy things in their new housing that they, things like toothpaste. So he approached me with, how can I help you? And that's how he approaches everybody in his network. And he has built now, they are doing I just wrote about this. It's sort of a cutting edge project in America where they have created a documentary about him that's launching, but it's going to launch in the city of Chicago. They have a coalition of all the homeless organizations, and he's there also making connections with activists, with other agencies, and they're going to do this very social media integrated campaign to raise awareness about homelessness, and also to run a fundraiser to build a fund to support individuals who need to transition out of homelessness. And this all started with this guy on Twitter with his cell phone trying to get stories out about the plight of homelessness.
I don't know whether other people in New Zealand find that Twitter is less productive than Facebook.
I'll say from my experience as a newcomer here, I think there's circles and there's other circles. So there's circles that are using Twitter, but there may be different circles than you're in. And I'll just tell one story in terms of my experience coming new here. I'm based in Wellington, which is one of the early contacts that I found was Inspiral, which many of you may have heard of, which is a social enterprise hub in Wellington. And the first thing that I learned, first of all, is they actually didn't have a big presence. I actually sort of wondered when I looked at their website if they were a little under the radar. But when I met them and I asked and I learned about it, and the more I learned in one meeting, the more excited I got, and I asked, how can I learn more? And basically, the message I got was, well, if you want to be in community with us, we're happy to share with you. How would you like to share with us? And they have a site that they use internally. It's called Yammer. Has anybody heard of Yammer? So it's a how would you describe Yammer?
Private Twitter.
A private Twitter. So it's a private. You have to be invited in, and the reason is they're trying to grow enterprises. And they want to suss people out. They want to figure out, do you fit with our values and sort of what we're about? And this whole notion of reciprocity. And so I think they're less than 2 years old, and they've been growing enterprises. And I'm trying to document them for my work here. And it's very difficult because they change every day. And so, from when they're new enterprises forming, they're new people in the circle, and I've literally met, dozens and dozens and dozens of people through just that one initial contact. I mean, I guess the mayor, and interestingly, they have a person in New York, they have a person in Germany. I just met someone from the States who came over to Wellington to reside here in large part because they know about Inspiral. And they see that this whole, really sort of a movement is forming. And I'm going to connect Beth because one of the founders is about to go over and spend some time in Cambodia. But so I think that my experience is that that different communities are sort of using different tools, and there's not enough of the bridging opportunities to try to open up the conversation, because then it keeps the conversations closed within certain circles.
And also that it's not necessarily having to reach every single person in the area. Doesn't necessarily have to be on a certain platform, but because people, the influencers who are using social media, we call them the hyper-connected. I guess I'm a hyper-connected person. Stephen's a hyper-connected person. Once you reach a hyper-connected, influential person, their influence is not just on the platform, but it's also on other platforms, and it's also offline. And I'll tell you a story about that. Been doing work in India, and India has a huge population, as you know, but maybe 3% are on Facebook, and maybe a half of a percent are on Twitter. And there's a NGO there called Pratham Books. Is anyone familiar with them? Their mission is to increase the reading skills of young, children in India by making sure that high quality books are donated to poor rural villages. And a fairly large NGO, and they're actually a really interesting model of a networked NGO, one of the first ones that I found outside of the US as I started to travel about. And so they have, they have a blog, they were on Twitter, they were on Facebook, and they had actually everybody on staff also on these platforms, all talking about the organization's work. And so they published a story on their blog that they had read in a newspaper about some teenagers who put together a boy Corey, which is a bookmobile, and it was just like on a bicycle, the little cart behind it, and that they collected all these books in the big city and then took it out into this rural area and distributed books, and they thought it was a great story. So they wrote about it on the blog, and one of their donors left a comment on the blog that said, "This is such a great story. I will donate some more money so those kids can take more books out to that rural village." And so they had gotten the story from a newspaper, so they called the newspaper up and says, do you know the names of those children, those teens, or do you have their number? And they said, no, we don't. So they had everyone on the board and on staff was tweeting. And again, not everybody in India was on Twitter, half of a percent of the total population. And within 12 hours, they got the names of and the phone numbers of those teens, and were able to get the donation, and the kids were able to get the books back, another shipment of books to that village. So it isn't necessarily having to reach everybody.
There's a few NGOs in New Zealand that have really grasped how Twitter can really spread their message. The New Zealand Drug Foundation do international policy work as well as working on New Zealand drug policy law. And they've got a tweeting CEO. And they've grown quite a large following, but it's also the connection with kind of United Nations policy, and that within that particular niche, like alcohol drug law reform, it's quite a niche community, but they actually have built up. It's proving quite valuable for them to communicate out their message, stay in touch with people, and do a lot of work in connecting. Yeah. So I guess there's something about their audience where it's just working for them to invest that time and resource and really keeping it flowing.
So that's going to be different for different NGOs.
Yeah.
They'll be looking for different audiences, and they'll have different capacities. We work with ones with one employee up to, 100 maybe. It's going to really vary across.
Yeah.
And then there's a question about who's got the time and the energy. You said the CEO's got the time to do the tweeting there. A lot of organisations, the CEO wouldn't have the additional time that might be required, or they'd have to think about how to do it. Are there any kind of rules of thumb about size of organisation, purpose of organisation, type of tool?
No. It all depends. It's different. There are some maybe rules of thumb about being effective, but it's not like this type of organization should use Twitter. It's not that. It's more principles. And so I think getting back to one thing you said about where are we going to find the time, and that's I think that's a universal thing I've heard literally around the world. I don't have time. I don't have the time. And the first part of it is when I answer this question, it's about I don't have the time as a scarcity frame, and working in a network, you get to have an abundance frame. Okay, an example of that is a very small nonprofit. It's U.S. or it might have been England, but no, U.S. Was this? It was junior achievement. So they train youth in starting enterprises and business skills. And so they were using Twitter to try to do some fundraising, and they were out there saying, join our benefit, do this for me, do that for me, and they were about to say, this is not doing anything for us. And so then they said, okay, I'm going to start back, and I'm going to look at the people that are following us, and I'm going to really get to know who they are and start just having conversations with them. And they actually found somebody who was had a family foundation, a family trust, and was interested in girls programming. And so we started having this conversation. She was sharing some of the work she was doing with young girls, and then she invited her to lunch, and then they ended up getting a fairly large grant from it. And so it's more like, if she hadn't sort of invested the time, and it wasn't that much, then the funding would have not come. So it's, I don't have time can be is a scarcity frame. When you work with networks, there's abundance. Now, then it's a matter of taking a look at how are we spending our time, and is there a better way for us to spend, so there's some things that we should not be doing where we can make time for social media. And one NGO said, well, you know what, we have these hour-long meetings. Maybe we should, and I think that we don't need a whole hour to have a meeting on this topic. Maybe we should have a 45-minute meeting and spend the other 15 minutes on social media. So, or just taking a look at is this use of time for our organization the most effective? And is there a way that we can start with a small amount of time to allocate for social media and see if it works for us?
So the question is to get the balance right, yeah? Because you can end up going too far the other way and spending too much time on social media, getting a lot of noise. So
Yes.
it's getting exactly to the right place.
Yeah.
And the trick is how to do that.
Yeah, the trick, I think the rule of thumb is to have a clear outcome in mind, to have a clearly defined audience, and and to be really focused on where you're going to go, what tools you're going to use. And I see a lot of NGOs getting into trouble because they try to do too much. They try to be on everything and spread themselves too thin. And a lot of the peer training groups I work in, we get them, okay, forget about all of that. Just let's go here and just focus on this. And we're going to take 6 months, and you're going to be very disciplined about this. And the discipline is, learning the craft and the tool craft of using this tool, but also the mindset and the way of working, building relationships. And you're going to spend, a half-hour day, 5 days a week to start, because it's going to be very, very focused and bringing it down to a really practical baby step. And that's where you have the right balance. I also teach a lot on, it's called mindful social media versus mindful or mindless. And a lot of times what might happen, I see it a lot, is that, and I've found it in my own practice, is that because networks can be like this, I don't know how to explain it, it's like this, like this, yes. And it can actually take your attention and distract it. So you have to actually learn how to train your attention and know when it's wandering, and knowing when, oh my God, I'm looking at my friend's cat pictures. And that wasn't my goal. I needed to post on Facebook, and catch yourself.
Beth, do you want to share? There's a great diagram that was shared with people on Saturday, which is you've shared in other places to just talking about this mindfulness, because I think it's something that all of us probably face, like, gosh, this is too much and it's overwhelming. And
you can get captured in the vortex.
Yeah, so somebody's got this nice diagram that has a whole lot of the techniques that you can use to sort of prompts. And we spent about an hour or half an hour at the workshop on Saturday where people were talking about things that they were using to stay on top of this, because it is a deluge. It never seems to end. Yeah.
Let's see if we have. This is when it doesn't work, right?
Oh, hopefully just press the button.
Well, in the early days of when we had these, when these first came out about 15, 20 years ago, they were huge, and they never worked. And I was teaching teachers to use the internet, and they were very skeptical. And I happened to be in a classroom where there was also a blackboard. And so when it did work, it said, it's not a matter of, if, it's when, and how you're going to be creative in fixing the problem. And so I ended up doing my whole presentation with chalk and a blackboard. All right, so the diagram. Maybe we can also, I think I have some, everyone can see my directory structure. One of the best practices also is being extremely organized and structured if you're doing social media, and not being unstructured. So everything has, even though it seems organic, there is, it's very organized. Let's see. Here we go. There. It actually comes from this from Australia. So what we did actually with this, the instruction started with, here's what's called mindful social media, and kind of take them through studies that show how, how many of you are dependent on the internet to get your work done? Yeah, fairly, okay. And here we are trying to get our work done, and we're doing it on the biggest procrastination tool ever invented known to mankind. And you can see that little blue slice of the pie is that we're actually getting something done, and the rest of it is being distracted. And that's kind of an exaggeration to make a point, but and this is, I monitor a lot of kind of digital use trends, and 39% of people check their phones in the bathroom, So,
Alright, so that means 4 people here do, right?
Maybe more, maybe we're not the average here.
It's terrible.
So and again, this is the part of the instruction. I made people go through a quiz, yes or no, in terms of, and this is really about, self-knowledge is the first step. So be really intentional about how you're using it online. And each of these questions, some of them are kind of humorous, but they represent habits that need to be changed in your own practice. Is the only time you're offline is when you're sleeping. And I've had people answer yes to that. In fact, there was a chap from the workshop who actually said one of his to-dos was not to check his email not to be online anymore, to shut off everything 2 hours before he goes to bed. Because he said the last thing he would do at night would be check the email or check the social networks, and the first thing he did in the morning was check the email, check the networks. And so as of the result of the workshop we did on Saturday, we had people actually reflect on their habits, that he was going to make a change to be more effective online. So that's what each of these questions are about. And we give people a score, the number of yeses. So there's a score there. If they're 0 to 3, they're very mindful. In the middle, they need, they have some good and bad habits, and then at the high end, they need help. And at the Saturday workshop, we had maybe 3 people who were 0 to 3, and we had 3 or 4 people who were 7 to 10, and most people were in the middle. And again, this comes from actually Howard Reingold's work, NetSmart, which is a great book for looking at individual practice. And so the idea is that it's not so much that this stuff is distracting, it's just that it doesn't have to own our attention, and we can train our attention to be on task. But there's also this other side that when you're being a network and you're building relationships, the reciprocity happens as a result sometimes of serendipity. And if you're so rigid and so structured, you won't be open to the serendipity of discovering new people and making those new relationships. But it doesn't have to be how you spend all of your time online. For example, myself, I schedule my serendipity time. I have time on my schedule where I've given myself 20 minutes to bounce. If I'm looking at cat pictures, it's okay, because it might lead me to this amazing person someplace in the world who is working with NGOs around social media. It has happened. But I have it on my iPhone, the bell goes off, I stop. And I don't do that while I'm in the middle of trying to get a task done, and I've scheduled that time separately. That's how I manage it. And then so we spent a good, folks had about a good half hour taking this, we had a paper copy of this map, reflecting on their practice.
I have a question.
I'm just going to say, Beth has already uploaded all the resources from her New Zealand trip, and I'll write it on the board. So this presentation is shared with anyone in the world, and obviously it doesn't make quite much sense without someone talking through it, but I'll write the web address up on it, and we'll pass you the details in a second. Yeah.
We also have all the documentation from the workshop as well, all the photos and what people we're going to take as their next action steps. This component is, there's, because everyone at that workshop were the folks who were implementing social media, we did some focused work around individual practice, but most of what we discussed at the workshop was about effective use of networks and social media for the organization. So it's like kind of a both.
Beth, do you find very different approaches? You said start with intention, and I find for my own practice, if I'm focused on learning versus connecting versus, let's say, trying to raise money for something, those would just be 3 totally different intentions, that I might approach it differently.
Well, I would say it's, that's a really great question. Let me think about that for a moment. No, because I think with networks there's a certain practice, and I think that there is that open-ended, organic, serendipity, relationship building, sort of softer, really important part of network building, network weaving. But then there is the discipline side as well, and I think it's a balance. Because, you have to think about the outcomes. Like, what do you want the network to achieve for you? And maybe learning, I used to look at it, learning may be an early stage part of network development. And it is, because when you're building a network, this is really high level, there's what we call the catalytic stage. Okay, so that's where, and especially from a funder's point of view, in that we want the NGOs that we are funding and supporting capacity building, we want to link that to our grant strategy. End homelessness, get children vaccinated, whatever, create economic sustainability for women, or whatever the big result is. But so using a network to get to that begins with this catalytic stage of bringing people together, getting them to trust each other, see who they are. The next stage is this networked capacity building, where people are learning from one another and they're trading best practices, they're learning together, practices are being transferred. And then at the next stage, there is a alignment, where people become aligned around that higher end goal, and then there's the production towards that goal. And what happens is that sometimes we want to start the network and we start them right off in the production piece and they're not ready, because it's an incremental evolution. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
I think it's a little bit the difference between having a sort of one-off objective and using your network for that purpose versus having an ongoing, being sort of in relationship with a dynamic network.
Exactly. And also, networks are kind of like, I think of them like the tide, like the ocean tide. We were at Bethel's Beach and it was low tide. So there was a lot of beach, and then there'll be high tide. So sometimes networks just need to be at that learning from each other stage, so that they're connected and know each other to when there is when something happens and they need to align. A crisis happens, or a potential legislation might be up and it needs to be fought, so that the network is there and it can rise up. From a funder's point of view, it's less expensive to keep it running at the learning from each other piece than the production piece, which may require more staffing, more resources to sustain. So it can rise up and then come back.
I think that's a really good analogy, because I think what often happens is we set them up and we're good at network development, and this is more the face-to-face than using social media. But then they outlive their purpose, but we're not very good at stopping them. So, networks become for the sake of the network meeting, so you have a meeting every 3 or 4 times a year, whatever, because that's what you do. And so I think you'll often get stuck in sharing ideas and keeping each other up to date stage, which is quite different to bringing the group together to actually say we want to change something, we want to, you know, make a difference in a particular issue, and we're going to have a period and then we're going to end, you know. And I think my experience of that is that often networks just carry on because their purpose is probably more about just at that sharing and staying connected personally level.
Well, let me pull up, actually, I have a good chart, funders meeting, actually. See if we can put this up. That illustrates that. Where are we?
I've just done a little, this Bitly is a way of sharing long URLs. So this is on Beth's website. It's called Beth Kanter wikispaces.com New Zealand plus full day workshop. By inserting Bitly, it takes you, that address there, bit.ly and it's about to write it up, takes you to exactly the same page, but it's giving me some information, it's making it easier for you to type it in, but it's also giving me some information about the number of visits. So I can just get a bit of an idea of how widely it's being shared, and it will show me the number of times that, because I will probably tweet this, then I can track how many people shared it in Twitter. It's sort of, this is a tack off, sorry, I've just diverted you from the deep conversation into a tactical one, but that's a practice to help, I guess, inform, is it worth sharing all these website links through Twitter? Well, that is going to help me. If I only get one person clicking on a link, I think, oh, I don't want to share stuff like that anymore. If I get 20, it's like, gosh, people like that within the group of people that I'm sharing with, I'll share more along those lines. So Bitly is free. It's just a free service. You create an account. I'm happy to, I've got it on here, so.
That's great. So back to your point about, you know, the purpose. So this is a theory of change light.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Theories have changed a lot, so that makes sense.
Okay, this is a highly simplified theory of change. And actually kind of worked on through this in my second book, which is all about measurement. And sort of the spirit behind that book was a lot of NGOs don't like measurement, and I didn't like measurement either. I was afraid of it. You know, I thought, you know, I had to have statistics in order to do measurement. And I collaborated with a measurement expert. And one of the initial things I found with interviewing a lot of NGOs where they just didn't want to make time for measurement, it was too much. So the whole book is about making it more user-friendly, do-it-yourself, ways that you can use measurement to learn and improve your practice.
By measurement, do you mean evaluation? Is it a different?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't use the E word.
Oh, you don't use the word?
Yes, we use the, yes. The E word. Or we call it measurement and learning, and improvement, continuous improvement. So this theory of change, or theory of change light, is for a peer learning group of hacker grantees that I've been working with, that are, the ultimate goal is for there be a policy change at the national and state level for children to get health insurance. They want the ultimate goal is that all kids are healthy. In order for all kids to be healthy, they have to have access to health insurance. Because in the US, not everybody has access to health insurance. In order for that to happen, grantees' communication strategies need to have more impact on policy and that social change outcome. The step before that is that the grantees have to have better relationships with influencers